Today is Tuesday, September 15, 2020. It is episode number 72. Cash Balance Plan Part 6, Returns with Closing Your Plan every 7 years. This is 39.6 Facebook Live Finance Show, the show that teaches high earners like yourself how to make your money work for you so you don't have to work for your money. We are continuing our Cash Balance Pension series today. I know this is like super exciting, but I'm really recording this for the replays because I know the information is super valuable for some of you guys out there and want this content to get out there because I don't think it even really exists. So today we're going to talk about when you close the plan down every 7 years. All right. Now, I've talked about this from multiple sides, both from the people getting a plan open and also for people who are just participating in a plan that's already there. Now, a lot of people still, no matter what I tell them about your global asset allocation and that you really only have one portfolio, they still cannot get past the idea that you're only going to get potentially like 4% returns on your investment in the plan. Okay, so no matter how I explain this, still can't get over that. And I've seen really high earners who are investing tons of money in other things refuse to take this pre-tax deduction because they think they can do so much better. When you're paying 37% federal tax and then another 2.35% in Medicare tax plus state taxes, it is so hard to get ahead of that pre-tax benefit. Okay, that pre-tax benefit is a guaranteed tax benefit. It's more money in your pocket today. Okay, and having more money in your pocket means your wealth is higher. Okay, because you don't necessarily have to ever pay that money to the government in deferred tax. There's a lot of ways you can decrease that liability, potentially even to zero. Now, sorry about that. Okay, so what I've done is I've modeled the difference between investing in a cash balance plan versus just paying the tax on it upfront and investing it in a taxable account. Okay, so I know this is going to be small for people if you're using like your phone. Unfortunately, I can't do much about it because there's just so many numbers. But on a computer, you should be able to see this. Okay, so I apologize if you can't see it on your phone. Now, what I've done here is I've modeled out 30 years of time, okay, and what happens when you invest that money in a taxable brokerage versus your pension. So in the first column, I have a taxable brokerage account, and let's pretend you start out with $100,000. Now, after you pay the 37% federal tax and Medicare at 2.35%, that's 39.3, actually it's 1.45 plus 0.9, so it's 2.35. It's really 39.35% tax you would pay on that $100,000. So that's 39,000 something. So I rounded off to just paying 40% tax. Now that 40% tax on $100,000 simply is $60,000, okay? So in year one, you would be starting with $60,000 as opposed to the cash balance pension, and that would start out at $100,000, okay? Now, I'm going to assume you're going to get 3% or 4%, but let's just hide this 3%, and I'm going to make this just show 4% versus 8% so that you can see it a little bit bigger on your screen. Okay, there you go. Sorry about that. Okay, so you're starting out at $100,000 versus $60,000. This is like the tortoise versus the hare. Okay, you are so far ahead of that $60,000. Now I understand that you haven't paid tax on it. Okay, and we'll deal with that later. But just to show you have $100,000 more. So let's pretend your cash balance pension was in a 60% stock, 40% bond asset allocation, which I've seen some plans do, and that's actually a very common asset allocation for a traditional pension. If you had a 60-40 allocation, then 60% is stock, $60,000 would be in stocks and $40,000 would be in bonds. A lot of people who want to be all stocks all the time, well, if they paid the tax on it, they would pay $40,000 in tax, and we would be putting $60,000 in stocks. So you'd end up with the same amount of stocks anyway, 60,000 in each situation. Okay, but when you do it with a cash balance plan, instead of the $40,000 going to the government, you're putting that $40,000 in bonds. So think of it that way. It's like 40,000 extra dollars. Okay, and remember that Medicare tax savings you never have to pay again. But we are starting out at 60,000 versus 100,000. Now, after 1 year, let's just use a 4% return in the pension. So with a 4% return, that brings you up to 104,000, but then you contribute another 100,000, so it's $204,000. Okay. Now, in the other situation, $60,000, and you get an 8% return, that's twice as high. It gets up to 64,800. But then you add another 60,000 of contributions. Now you're at $124,800. Okay, so you continue doing that, and on the left column you keep getting an 8% return. So 8% on 125,000 is about $10,000. So that brings you to 134,000 plus $60,000 more that you're contributing. So now you're up to about 195,000, and you get another 8% on that. And that's another about 15,000. That gets you to 210. You add $60,000, you're at 270. Okay, so you continue and you get all the way to year 7, you're up to $535,000, and that's a good amount of money. Now, in the other situation where you're only getting that 4% return, you're at 100, 204, 312, 425, 541, 663, then you end up at $789,000. Okay, so you're way ahead. Then at the end of 7 years, you can close your pension down. Okay, then you take all that money out, and now you invest that and invest it in equities because you believe that all equities is going to get you 8%. So then I model it this way: that 789 continues getting 8% per year, but you start the new pension over, and then you add another $100,000 into the pension, and that pension gets 4%. Okay, so you continue doing this for the next 7 years. And in the right column, you have 2 pots. You have your cash balance pension pot, which grows up to another $789,000. And then you have the other half of the pot, which was invested in taxable brokerage, making 8%. And that ends up getting up to like $1.3 million. Okay, so you end up at $2.1 million at the end of year 14. On the other side of the coin, you've been in the taxable brokerage the entire time, but you're only putting in $60,000 per year. You end up at $1.4 million versus 2.1. That's after 14 years. So then we continue, and we're going to go all the way up to a later time point, all the way up to year 21. So remember, at the end of year 14, the plan closed again. So then you put all of that 2.1 million into your taxable brokerage account, okay? Or you put it into an IRA, or you put it somewhere else where you're able to invest it. Taxable brokerage is probably not where it's going because you'd have to pay tax on it, but you'd roll it over to your 401k, you'd roll it over to your IRA where it will stay pre-tax, and you can invest it however you would like to and get your 8%. At the end of year 21, you're at 4.5 million versus $3 million. Okay, and we're going to continue up to year 28, and you're at 8.4 million versus 5.7 million. Then you do 2 more years, and you're at 10 million versus $6.8 million. Okay, so that is a huge difference. It's $3.2 million different in value. Your net worth is $3.2 million higher. Now, you haven't paid tax on it. I get it. But remember, you were saving at 40%, and you're going to roll it over to your 401k or IRA, and then you're going to take potentially required minimum distributions, okay? And you're going to take it out at a lower tax rate, okay? So I did this same situation, okay? And I corrected it, and I assumed that you're going to pay tax on it at a certain rate. So if you were to take money out in the first 10 years, your pile of money is not that big. So I estimated a 10% effective tax rate on that withdrawal. But then if you were in there longer and now you have more money, if you do withdrawals between year 11 and 20, I estimated an effective tax rate at 15%. But if you are in there longer and you have withdrawals at years 21 to 30, I put in a 20% effective tax rate on those dollars. Okay, so what I did was I corrected the pre-tax to post-tax using estimates. Okay, there's nothing perfect about this. There's no way to really model this in any reasonably simple fashion. So I had to basically make up tax rates that you would be paying. Now, on the left side and on the right side, you can see here $60,000 versus $90,000 because I'm assuming you're going to pay 10% tax if you pull that money out, okay, at that point. Now, as we get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, all the way to year 30, we end up with $8 million versus $7 million, okay? Now, still way ahead, that's more than 14% higher, okay? You're never, ever, ever ahead using the taxable brokerage account as your place to insert the money because you're paying 40% tax up front. And this isn't even including state tax. With state tax, you're getting potentially close to 50% as your marginal tax rate on those dollars. And that's just using current tax brackets. If we go back to 39.6 as being the top tax bracket, that's where the name comes from. And you were to add state tax, Social Security, Medicare, you can easily be getting 50%, especially in a high tax state, high tax city. Okay, the difference is gigantic. Now, that's assuming you get 8% versus 4%. Now, remember, the cash balance pension could do higher, and you could say, oh, equities could do higher too. And so I modeled a bunch of different situations. I'm going to unhide them here. I'm going to upload this file so that you can access it. But we're going to look all the way up here at 10% returns. Okay. So even if you were to get 10% returns in your cash balance pension, in your taxable brokerage versus 4% returns in a cash balance pension, at year 7, you're at 789 versus 569. Okay, and then remember, you roll it out, and if you're ahead after 7 years, you're going to be ahead all the way through. Okay, even after paying the tax, the difference here is still $1 million. Now, if we go to higher returns, let's go to 12% returns in your taxable brokerage account. 12%, that's a lot, and you get 4% in the pension. At the end of 7 years, you have $605,000 in the taxable brokerage versus $789. So you close it down, roll it over. Now the difference is actually 19 million versus 14.5 million. So that's a $4.5 million spread. If you account for tax, it's still $700,000 difference. Okay, you're never ever ahead. Taking the taxable brokerage account. Now, if you are to be more conservative, let's pretend and keep your plan open, okay? I also modeled if you were to do a 10-year rollout instead of 7-year rollout. So I'm going to zoom in on this to 400%. Okay. And I have returns at 6% for equities, 7%, 8%, 9%, 10%, 11%, 12%. Okay. So if you were to get 12% returns, okay, and I'm including 3% and 4% in the cash balance pension. If you got 12% returns in your taxable brokerage and you got only 3% in your cash balance pension, at the end of 10 years, you're at 1.15 million versus 1.05 million in favor of the cash balance pension. Okay, it's still always ahead, but it gets very close at year 10, but then you close it out. If you get 4% in the cash balance pension, it's 1.2 million versus 1.05 million. So you're still way ahead. Now, if you were to pay tax on this, however, you do start seeing a difference. If you're getting 12% returns on your taxable brokerage and only 3% on your cash balance pension, the first 10 years you're ahead on the cash balance, but then after that, you're behind. If you get a 4% return in the cash balance pension, you're ahead for the first 20 years. Okay, that's a long time to be ahead. And that guaranteed extra savings is guaranteed. Okay, and you have to get 12% over 20 years in order to actually get ahead. The likelihood of getting 12% over all of that time compared to getting a 4%, I mean, the likelihood is a lot lower. Okay, so the risk adjusted return is so far in favor of doing a cash balance pension because you don't necessarily have to stay in this pension for perpetuity. Now, if your pension plan is at, a university, then yeah, you're probably stuck in it for a long time. But most universities, again, don't have cash balance pensions. If you're doing this in a private group, there's no reason to keep your cash balance pension open for more than 10 years. Okay, you can close that down and roll it out, let everybody get their capital in their 401k or their IRA, and then start over again. Okay, that should be super, 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 super safe, at least based on current practice. Okay, so if you're considering getting a plan open and people are saying, I don't want a low return because I don't want 3% or 4%, and I can do way better in whatever private equities I'm doing, fine. Okay, but from a risk-adjusted basis, if someone's paying 40% tax at the federal level plus tax at the state or local level in addition, the math is the math. You can't outmath math, right? This is just so safe, and again, it's asset protected. Okay, it's a qualified ERISA plan. This will roll into your 401k and stay protected from creditors. It's so hard to build that bucket. People often talk about pre-tax and post-tax buckets, but very, very rarely do they refer to asset protected versus not asset protected buckets. And that asset protected bucket can become gigantic if you open up the cash balance plan. All right, that is it for episode number 72. I'll upload this spreadsheet. I'm pretty proud of this one. I did not make this one on the fly today, right before the show, like most of my other ones. This one I worked on for many hours previously. It's not nearly as useful as my federal, state, progressive effective tax brackets, but it's quite powerful when people think they can do better than a cash balance pension and they're making a ton of money. So until tomorrow, which will be Wednesday, September 16th, this is simply for your entertainment purposes. Oh, my entertainment purposes. Maybe your entertainment purposes. Tomorrow, I don't know what I'm going to talk about. We'll decide maybe like 5 minutes before we go on. If you have any questions, please post them in the Facebook group. I do appreciate people posting questions, and I do try to answer all of them if I can. Take care.